Greater Phoenix. We can tell our story differently. A new perspective. A different look. Greater Phoenix A to Z.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when this finds you. Welcome to the Greater Phoenix A to Z podcast. I am your host, Tim Bourcet. Today's show is focused on a legacy industry that is booming in Greater Phoenix, the great topic of semiconductors. As some of you may know, Motorola introduced microelectronics to the region when it opened a research and development facility in Phoenix in 1949. Now, more than 70 years later, Greater Phoenix has a thriving and diverse ecosystem that is home to research and development, manufacturing, and headquarters facilities for some of the most well-known companies in the industry, including Intel, onsemi, NXP, and most recently, TSMC, or Taiwan Semiconductor Company. Just a little roadmap. We've broken this episode into 3 parts, and we'll get into some of that history in our first segment. Later in the show, we'll talk about the CHIPS and Science Act with some of Senator Kelly's staff. And lastly, how advanced manufacturing will affect the future of our region. So let's get started. First up, joining me from the GPEC staff is Sean Fogarty, Vice President of International Business Development. Sean spent 15 years in Taiwan as the State of Washington Trade and Investment Representative, attracting Taiwanese foreign direct investment, or FDI, to the state. He has worked in the private and public sector across a range of industries such as technology, education, and in markets such as Taiwan, Singapore, China, and Hong Kong. He also served for 7 years as president of the American State Offices Association, a grouping of all the states with representative offices in Taiwan. So let's get this going. Sean, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure to be on.
Thank you, sir. Okay, let's start big picture here. We've heard a lot about semiconductors in the last few years. I think most of us who are not in the industry, such as yourself, probably didn't know what that was. But with recent investments and moves here to Arizona, we're getting a better idea. So again, very simply, what is this semiconductor?
Well, so I'm not going to pretend to be an engineer. So everything I'm going to explain here is what's been taught to me and explained to me in very general layman's terms. So a semiconductor is a material product usually comprised of silicon, which conducts electricity. Hence the name, it's a semiconductor of electricity. And in even more general sense, these semiconductors are the brains of modern electronics.
So during COVID, we saw everywhere in the news these supply chain issues, and I feel like that's when the semiconductor, term really came into view of most Americans, because it's TVs, electric vehicles, basically anything we touch, large scale, has semiconductors in it. Is that correct?
Yeah, so semiconductors are an essential component of just the modern day electronic devices. So everything from our communications, computing, healthcare, military systems, transportation, clean energy, and countless other applications all depend on semiconductors. And as you pointed out, when there was a shortage, that everyone realized just how critical it is to our economy. And
so, this sounds weird, but why should we care?
Well, the industry itself directly impacts 250,000 jobs, and it supports 1 million plus American jobs. In addition, when you highlighted the chip shortages, it's estimated that shortage impacted over 169 different industries. The chip shortage itself, for context, in 2021 caused about $200 billion in lost auto sales. So in just one industry, they experienced over $200 billion.
Billion with a B,
billion,
not with an M.
Billion with a B. And so this had direct impact on jobs, lots of plant closures. It also had a second order effect. Shortages led to increased prices. If you shop for a used car, you may have noticed they cost sometimes even more than a new car, if you could find one. And so on top of that, what's interesting is that chips are America's 4th largest export. And it's estimated that the semiconductor industry is going to become a $1 trillion industry by the end of the decade. So in a nutshell, semiconductors are foundational to our economy and to innovation.
So that's why my used 2009 Honda Civic, I had people offering me like 2 and 3 times the value a couple of years ago. Just a little note on the used car sales. That's when I knew things were getting bad, when somebody was going to buy my old hoopty for about twice what it was worth.
Exactly.
Okay, so we started big picture. You said you're not an engineer, but you are really smart. And so I think this next question you should be able to answer fairly well. So how is a semiconductor made?
Okay, so yeah, as you highlighted, it's a very complicated process. In fact, the entire process consists of thousands of steps and can take more than 3 months from design to production. In the entire span, it will range from the research, the design, the raw materials, the ingots. This is sand that's purified, melted into solid cylinders. These ingots are then sliced into very thin 1 millimeter silicon wafers, which are then polished to a flawless finish. These wafers are printed with highly intricate circuit designs that will become the individual chips. And so sometimes these wafers can hold up to 70,000 chips on one wafer chip. And so these packaged chips are basically these dies that are packaged into finished semiconductors and then embedded in these devices, electronic devices, medical devices, supercomputers. With regards to just the semiconductor manufacturing process, there's a lot of processes, but 6 major steps include deposition, photoresist, lithography, etch, ionization, packaging. So these are highly, highly specialized steps. These are highly specialized skills. And so it's a very globalized supply chain with hundreds of companies performing sometimes just one task.
No, that's great. Now, you started getting into, I guess, size, right? This kind of comparison's sake, because again, I think we always assume, oh yeah, most of this technology in these electronics is pretty small. But then once I started learning more over the years with our work at GPEC, talking to you, it's like, oh wow, that is quite small. So how small can these semiconductor wafers get? And more importantly, and for our work, who is making them?
So there's a difference, obviously, between the wafers and then the chips, right? The wafers hold the chips. So these wafers, as I mentioned earlier, are about 1 millimeter in thickness and typically maybe 300 millimeters in diameter. But these single wafers can hold up to, say, 70,000 semiconductor chips.
Crazy. On
just one single wafer. And so a nanometer, maybe I should explain what a nanometer is. So I searched on the web to find analogies. And so a single sheet of paper is about 100,000 nanometers in thickness.
One sheet of paper is about 100,000 nanometers.
That is right. A strand of human DNA is about 2.5 nanometers in diameter. And so it's very small. In fact, the term nano, the prefix itself, means 1 billionth. So it's 1 billionth of a meter.
My brain can't comprehend that.
And right now, one of the leading edge companies in semiconductor manufacturing, TSMC, has announced that they're going to open up a 5 nanometer facility. And on top of that, they're going to build a 3 nanometer facility.
So a facility that is roughly the size of a strand of human DNA.
Well, the chips are producing, yes, that are equivalent to 1 or 2 strands of human DNA. And so they are pushing the boundaries of engineering and physics. So
you're talking about kind of the layers and the designs. So again, going back in, like a chip what can a chip be the size of? Or how many does that hold?
Another analogy would be, it can be the size of a fingernail. And that fingernail can hold billions of transistors. So for example, Apple's A15 Bionic system on a chip contains 15 billion transistors and can perform 15.8 billion, a trillion operations per second.
Wow. Now you had talked about TSMC's plans. What is that? You were talking about them going smaller.
Yeah, so TSMC is by far the most advanced semiconductor manufacturer in the world. And so they have announced in December that they were going to build a second fab. Their first fab was announced in, I believe, May of 2020. Their second fab, which they announced in December of 2022, will now make Arizona, the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing hub in the world outside of Taiwan.
So you're talking about these transistors. So adding more transistors to a semiconductor chip does what exactly?
So essentially, these transistors emit electrical pulses. And so they do it very precisely. And so like the human brain, they're able to send a signal, ones and zeros. And so by adding more transistors, we're actually adding more processing power. And so in essence, the chip, this translates to more value, more functionality, lower power consumption, and lower costs. And so you've probably noticed our devices are getting smaller and smarter and faster and cheaper.
I would agree. Okay, so now I kind of want to talk about some of the history and kind of where we're going. So how have semiconductors defined technology here in the United States?
Well, in fact, the transistor was invented in the U.S. You had, I believe, Texas Instruments and Fairchild Semiconductor in '59 that came out with these transistors, and that ignited a revolution. The impact on society, on economies, was far deeper and bigger than the Industrial Revolution. And so we've seen this, at the very beginning, the U.S. had a 40% share of global capacity, and that shrunk to about 9%. And so we've seen our capacity shrink, but the U.S. government now and industry realizes that they want to recapture some of that global capacity.
And I'm going to assume you said we shrank from 40% of global market share to 9%. I'm assuming a majority of that loss was to Southeast Asia. Is that, or other countries, Europe, Southeast Asia?
Yeah, that's right. The Japanese, the Taiwanese, the Koreans, all learned to develop their own semiconductor ecosystem. So it's taken them decades to perfect their ecosystem. And so it's going to take us a while to achieve those goals.
And we're going to get into in our next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about how U.S. policy is trying to shift that. But let's focus on Greater Phoenix, as this is the Greater Phoenix podcast. So how has semiconductor technology shaped development here in the region?
Well, as you pointed out, Motorola was the first to come in and make this investment. Intel followed on, and they've been here for 40 years, investing tens of billions. In fact, they announced that they're going to become a foundry. They wanted to get into the foundry business, and they're going to expand, and I think put down $20 billion to facilitate that expansion. And so because of that, we've built out an ecosystem here, which is a draw for companies. And more importantly, we've got a talent pool, a growing talent pool. This is a critical gap that actually the whole world is fighting to develop now. And so the U.S., the semiconductor industry alone, it's estimated they'll need 1 million, in the workforce. That translates to about 100,000 a year. And just for context, we graduate, engineering and computer science majors at a rate of 100,000 a year.
So basically a 1-for-1 would be needed to even fulfill that.
And that's just the semiconductor industry.
Right. Not
you can imagine
everything else.
Yes, exactly. And so there's this massive talent gap. But because we've had a long time to build up this ecosystem, thanks to investments from other companies, including NXP, you've got Benchmark Technologies, onsemi, all of them operating here. We've got a growing cluster of companies that have built a base in this market. And now, of course, with TSMC bringing in leading-edge chips, this is only going to level up our workforce development and traction.
So to all our listeners, if you're thinking about making a career shift and you are have math and science skills, maybe go get your engineering degree, because there's going to be an abundance of job openings in the next decade. Okay, so final question regarding this material. I do have a fun one for you at the end, but final question. So you've been hitting global competition regarding chips manufacturing. And, I talked about this has really become front page news over the last few years due to shortages and needs and whatnot. How will the United States lead in this area moving forward?
So just to reiterate what I said earlier, so chips are the foundation for any economy, and it's key to innovation. And especially in a lot of these new emerging industries that we want to lead in. So 5G, IoT, AI. For that reason, developed economies, not just the U.S., they're all looking to build their own secure and resilient supply chain. And so I believe, with the recent passage of the CHIPS Act, this has been a huge catalyst. I believe it's catalyzed about $200 billion in semiconductor commitments. And so we expect, this is going to improve and increase public-private partnerships. It's going to enhance collaboration with academia, as I pointed out, basic research and workforce development. These are going to be key to maintaining our edge in these key industries and, of course, in rebuilding our semiconductor capacity.
No, that's great info, Sean, and I appreciate it. Again, up next, we're going to have Joe Russell, who we have worked with a lot, and he's going to really dig into the Chips and Science Act and really the monetary component of that, because one thing, along with just the pure economic development purpose, there is a national security interest as well, as you mentioned, with a lot of the manufacturing being overseas over the last couple of decades. So great tee up. Now, before you go, you and I talk a lot about food. We enjoy a good meal. We enjoy a variety of food. But you've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia. So what is the one comfort meal or food you miss from your days overseas?
Well, first of all, Tim, I got to thank you for introducing me to the Instant Pot.
That's right, baby.
Yeah, I was a slow adopter, but I'm so happy that I did. So thank you for that. But back to your question, there's really too many to choose from. I mean, Taiwan really is a food kingdom. It's a foodie paradise. Street food is abundant. There's tons of these mom and pops, restaurants that just serve freshly made meals every day. But if I had to choose, I mean, it's got some of the best seafood, fruits and vegetables. I mean, before moving to Taiwan, I didn't eat seafood. But my colleagues took me to a seafood restaurant where they serve tuna, sashimi. And I was like, oh my goodness, raw seafood. And I went ahead and gave it a try. And it just melted in my mouth like butter. It was amazing. It was the freshest seafood I had ever tasted in my life. And I got hooked on it ever since. On top of that, I mean, beef noodles. There's this hole-in-the-wall restaurant near where I live. But, they were in fact recognized by the Michelin Guide as, being a top-notch spot, and it's got a wonderful, wonderful family that runs it for decades now, and the mangoes. I think bar none, they have the best mangoes.
I love a mango
in the world.
Yeah, and when you're talking about these mom and pop shops, it reminds me of that famous show where Anthony Bourdain and President Obama, they were at that, I think it's like a little noodle place in Thailand, and it's just a little hole in the wall.
In Vietnam.
It's Vietnam, right, thank you. Yeah, and I always laugh. My buddy went and visited there, and they have like a little mantle, like paying homage to both the president and Anthony Bourdain. And that's when you mentioned that, that's what it made me think about, is that just probably a mom and pop shop, best noodles you're ever going to have. So now I guess the question is, are you going to be able in your work to bring some of those folks over here? Can we get some, some of that local flavor, but here in the region?
Oh yeah, we're definitely trying, and we're working with a number of cities to try and attract some of these franchises, food and beverage franchises here to market. So fingers crossed, we'll see something.
Well, Sean, I appreciate your time today. Thank you for all the work that you've done here. Obviously at GPEC, you've only been here now a year, but your impact has been massive. And thank you for kind of teeing this up again. Next segment, we're going to get a little deeper into the Chips and Science Act. But this was the perfect first segment to really kind of show our listeners, what we're getting into. So, Sean, appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim, and you've been a great host. Appreciate it.
Okay, next on the podcast, very excited for our next guest. We have Joe Russell, legislative assistant to Senator Mark Kelly.
Thanks, Tim. It's great to be here.
Joe, welcome to the show. I've gotten to know you over the last couple of years through some of our work on federal policy issues, such as CHIPS, which we're about to get into. But please introduce yourself to the audience, give them a little background information so they can get to know you a little bit better.
Sure. Yeah, no. So I'm an Arizona native. I grew up in Tempe. My first jobs in college were working on campaigns in Arizona, in Tucson, and then in Phoenix. And then, for the past almost going on 5 years now, I've worked in the Senate in DC, first for Senator Sinema, and then I worked for Senator Kelly since he got sworn in December 2020. So I do a whole range of policy work for the senator on his team out here in DC for his Environment and Public Works Committee portfolio, and then a whole bunch of other issues related to that: transportation, economic development, water infrastructure, aviation, space, science, technology, small business. So it's a fun time, and it's good to be
And
here.
good news, the voters of Arizona have decided that you shall be employed for another 6 years. So a big win for everybody.
Yes, it's an exciting
All
time.
right. So Joe, previously we were just speaking with GPEC staff, kind of big picture on this semiconductor ecosystem, something that 10 years ago very few people knew about. Now I feel like you can't open the Wall Street Journal or get on Twitter or hear anything, economic development or manufacturing related without this talk of semiconductor and chips. Now, again, previously we kind of teed up the differences between those, but you, your office, and obviously the U.S. Senate were instrumental in the passing of the CHIPS and Science Act from last year. And again, I know you were kind of on the ground level on most of that. Could you just let's just talk about the history of, and I'm going to refer to it as the CHIPS Act. I understand as the CHIPS and Science Act, but for brevity's sake, we're going to just call it the CHIPS Act. Can you kind of go into how long was the legislative process for this act? Just big picture over the last few years. How did this develop?
Sure. No, it honestly all kind of started in the summer of 2020, honestly, right after the TSMC deal was announced in Arizona. And kind of, if you remember the what was going on in the world at the time, this is when we started to see supply chain disruptions from COVID and kind of increased Chinese investment in a lot of these critical technologies. And there was a realization in Congress that the U.S. is becoming increasingly reliant on semiconductors produced in Southeast Asia, and that can present a real economic security threat and a real national security threat. So this is certainly when the idea started, but it's been quite the path to where we are today, which is on the verge of having the CHIPS Act programs start to be rolled out.
And Joe, for our listeners, I know here in Arizona, we're very familiar with the Intel name, and this was essentially a breeding ground for some of that activity, late 80s, early 90s. And just to confirm, over the last 30 years, offshoring of this work primarily to China, Southeast Asia. So the U.S. has declined significantly until the CHIPS Act on actually manufacturing and producing these items.
No, that's right. Well, and there's also just broader market dynamics between, the 1990s when Arizona saw kind of a real development of our semiconductor ecosystem, and today global demand for chips has exponentially increased to the point that we're still producing more chips in Arizona today than we were 30 years ago. It's just that globally, every car sold today has a couple hundred chips in it, to say nothing of, your washing machine or your coffee maker or whatever it is. And so kind of as more and more devices become dependent on these chips, we've increasingly seen that excess supply be produced overseas, especially when it comes to some of these more legacy systems that, for a long time we thought it's fine to make an iPhone chip in the US, but when you're making a chip for a car or a missile system, sometimes we see those produced. They're more legacy systems and they're produced overseas. And I think for a long time, everyone felt like that was a good thing. I think what we really saw starting in 2020 through to today is that there are real risks to seeing whole supply chains stop because we can't make a car run without these critical technologies now. So that was kind of the environment in which Congress started working on the CHIPS and Science Act. And it honestly all started in 2020. We saw the fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorization Act is really what created the CHIPS Act program, as we call it today. I think Congress does kind of a two-step process to make any kind of policy on the federal level, is you have to first authorize a program and then you kind of appropriate it. So the FY21 National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, kind of authorized the creation of these CHIPS Act programs, and kind of three buckets of these programs, I think, is the way that I, kind of think about it. You've got a manufacturing incentive grant program, sometimes called the Section 9902 program, because that's the section it was in this NDAA. And that's what provides cash incentives to manufacturers, your TSMCs, your Intels, but also the suppliers and kind of broader ecosystem of these companies to construct, expand, or modernize their production facilities in the U.S. We also authorized a separate program to kind of focus on DoD specific needs. Again, kind of focus on creating test beds where you can have researchers who kind of are developing products that specifically meet needs of the Department of Defense and produce those. We're actually seeing some real cool innovations coming out of ASU to try to find ways to participate in that program. And then kind of a third program, which is focused on commercial scale research and development, things like it's called the National Semiconductor Technology Center, the National Advanced Packaging Program. These are kind of these intended to be big national initiatives that'll bring industry and academia and state and local governments together to try to make sure that we're building the next generations of these cutting edge microchips here in the US as opposed to overseas.
No, that's a great historical review. I appreciate that. Now, I've heard you mention it twice in our work over the last couple of years, obviously, well down this rabbit hole. You discussed economic development justifications. So kind of from our world, kind of economic development 101, building stuff, making stuff, shipping stuff. So, what were some of those? You already kind of hit on it with manufacturing of household goods. So what are some of those justifications? And then second follow on, because you had just talked about the NDAA, is what are the national security justifications for this? Because it seems to be a twofold determination for this.
No, that's right. And I mean, I think kind of for both of them, it starts with we can't have supply chains that make kind of these critical materials cross an ocean, whether it was COVID lockdowns or, the backlogs we saw at shipping ports in California or anything else. If you have production lines in the US that depend on the production of these semiconductors and all of a sudden deliveries slow down or halt, not only do you see kind of economic harms for those exact products, but you have a whole knock-on effect. We see, everything from, consumer goods to cars were getting crazy expensive in 2020, 2021, 2022 because of kind of these slowdown in the chip supply chain. And the way that you mitigate that is by creating more demand, kind of making sure that we're nearshoring or onshoring more of those production capabilities so that we're less vulnerable to those supply chain shocks. And I mean, it's also from an economic perspective, this is a huge opportunity for the US. I mean, these are jobs that most of them don't require a 4-year degree. They're jobs where you make a salary that you can raise a family on, which is game changing for communities like Arizona. And I mean, it's a huge knock on throughout the community, right? Creating these jobs in places like Arizona is not only creating good paying jobs for the people who work for these semiconductor companies, but it also, builds our tax base. It creates all the jobs and service sectors that kind of come around these areas. So it's a huge boon for communities throughout the state that I think is something that Congress really wanted to find a way.
Appreciative of you bringing up TSMC, because obviously that was the catalyst for so much, even before the CHIPS Act. And in the time TSMC was announced 3 years ago until now, and obviously the CHIPS Act is a large portion of this, their initial roughly $12 billion capital expenditure for this fab, as well as the number of jobs, has essentially doubled. They've already come out and said, yeah, 12 billion is great. Why don't we double that? And let's keep going. And then on the GPEC side, on our business development side, unfortunately, I cannot get into all of the names of the companies due to some NDAs and things, but we have dozens of supply chain companies in our pipeline who just want to be near our region, generally because of TSMC, but also Intel, Semi. There's all of these entities, and so I think you kind of hit that. Not only is it these manufacturers, but all of the follow-on. And I know every meeting we're at, our communities, as you just said, are very happy because while they might not have TSMC in their backyard, they are going to have companies working with TSMC in their backyard. And so I know our mayors, our council members, and our accountants at all those cities really enjoy, as you just said, the tax base. Now, just kind of a fun question before we get into a little bit more. I have to imagine that when your boss is a former fighter pilot and astronaut, he probably knows the semiconductor world a little bit better than most in the Senate. Did you find that to be true throughout the process?
No, that's absolutely true. And I think that's one of the reasons that he was able to be so effective kind of in this process is because when you have to, get in a room and get down to talking about the details at a member level, it's really useful to have somebody who can explain big picture and really getting down into the weeds why these investments are so critical and what the real national security implications are. I think it's really helpful to have somebody who, has seen how an F-16 has developed from, the Gulf War days to today and understand how many of those technologies, kind of big and small, that we build into fighter planes now are dependent on microelectronics in many cases, ones that aren't necessarily built in the US or are built in the US, but are, behind the kind of commercial leading edge because of kind of what capabilities exist in the US as opposed to exist elsewhere. So no, it's a huge passion project for my boss. And I think it's something that kind of he's really leaned into given his background and his experience and his understanding of these issues to make sure that, others in the Senate and the House are similarly aware and taking this kind of with the seriousness that it commands.
As a side note, I thought it was fairly hilarious over the last few years on any of his opponents on ads, how they would try to use him as, he's a fighter pilot and an astronaut in a bad way. And I just would chuckle to myself that generally people like those kind of things in a candidate, but that is neither here nor there. So now let's get into, I know something that your office has been working with us on for a while is this application process. And I know it is still ongoing. So just from a very high level, we've heard, this application process is going to open February-ish. And could you just kind of go in again, keep it high level, but for our listeners, because I can just tell you, I get asked me, a guy who's not you or Senator Kelly, hey, how do I apply for chips? And I go, so if you could just kind of roadmap out what that process looks like from what you know. Again, I know this is ongoing, but just maybe go into the application process a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe I'll start with the advice for anyone is the Department of Commerce, which is the federal agency overseeing all of this, has set up a great website for all information chips related. That's super easy to find at chips.gov. So definitely recommend that as a one-stop shop for all kind of details, including as more stuff gets rolled out going into later in the year. You mentioned February. Definitely a page I bookmark and would recommend folks interested in this also bookmark.
Love the shout out for that for everybody listening, because I knew we would get questions on that. Chips.gov.
Chips.gov. But yeah, so I mean, to kind of break down the CHIPS Act in general, it's $52 billion is the amount that's appropriated to the program overall. Of that, $39 billion is allocated to the manufacturing incentive grant program. This is, when we're talking chips, those are the economic development incentives that a company could get to, construct, expand, modernize their semiconductor manufacturing facility or a facility that supports semiconductor manufacturing. Kind of within that $39 billion, the Department of Commerce has already said kind of in their strategy documents that they're going to kind of think about that in two separate chunks. The first is kind of the biggest chunk will be for kind of large scale investments in leading edge manufacturing. So this is, your cutting edge sub 10 nanometer, fabrication facilities that are going to make the best chips that have ever been made in the U.S. And make sure that we're going to have supporting them. Here exactly. No, that's right. So kind of in that bucket, of the $39 billion, $28 billion is going to be allocated for those leading edge investments. And that makes, Tim, to your point, TSMC is investing $40 billion. I think Intel throughout the U.S. has announced that they're going to invest something like in excess of $100 billion in the next 10 years. So these are really expensive, really hard to make chips. A good chunk of the CHIPS funding is going to be allocated towards supporting these projects to make sure that those companies decide to build here and not overseas. The second kind of chunk is an $11 billion pot that's going to be for new manufacturing capacity for mature and current generation chips, as well as for all of the suppliers of the tools and materials and equipment that go into making semiconductors. So again, think about these, in Arizona context, right? These are, we've got lots of companies that make, the power microelectronics, the legacy logic chips that go into cars or washing machines, or kind of what is it, your NXPs, your microchip, and kind of other companies. This is kind of the pot of funding that can support the expansion of those capabilities to, again, make sure that auto manufacturing lines aren't going to be shut down because of a lack of kind of the chips that go into those products. And then also helping all of our suppliers, the companies that make the tools or make the chemicals or the substrates or do the packaging for the chips that are going to come out of the TSMC fab, are able to compete for that $11 billion pot. And all of this, I should note, is, separate from, there's also, right, CHIPS and Science creates a 25% investment tax credit for all construction, expansion, or modernization of semiconductor facilities as well. So in addition to kind of your hard cash grants that folks are able to get because of the CHIPS Act, there's also a tax credit that Congress has created to also support kind of these investment projects, which will be kind of a really nice multiplier to just further enhance kind of the types of investments that folks are able to make.
I know the GPEC, the GPEC network, our prospect pipeline, that it, incentivized tax credit actually seemed to be kind of the gold the meat and potatoes.
Oh, yeah.
I know that hard cash is very important, but anytime you can incentivize those folks up front, that seemed to be a major win with a lot of those individuals. So I appreciate that breakdown. Now, just kind of like a larger question before we get into our last one here. You were talking about that allocation of money, and it's that finite amount, that 38 bill. What does it look like down the line? Like, I get how this is, the monies will be dispersed and whatnot. And do you think that this will turn into what is essentially, I don't know if reoccurring is the right word, but is there an appetite for this to move once those monies are dried up, which sounds like they will be dried up because there's a lot of people applying. What is the likelihood of something like this continuing down the road, whether in its current form or in a different form?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and I guess can maybe take two different approaches. The one is, this is a lot of money. We talk about billions of federal dollars, like it's nothing. This is a serious investment that the federal government hasn't made. You could argue the closest comparisons are to programs that we had during the Second World War and Great Depression. So this is a new novel program that is kind of unique to this specific industry and because of kind of how critical it is to U.S. national security and economic security. So it's fair to assume that Congress doesn't do this all the time. The $39 billion is around for 5 years. The Department of Commerce is going to make sure that it lasts for that 5 years. It's certainly possible if we see, success, and we've done this previous times. There are initiatives like Semitech or others that we saw in the 80s and 90s that provide precedent for, other federal action. But I think it's fair to assume that from a business investment decision, this is a unique opportunity, and this is funding that'll be here for 5 years. And certainly, I think it'd be probably not the best decision to make to assume that Congress will be able to just kick in another $50 billion. Down the road. But
come on, Joe. Congress works so well together. We see it every day on the news.
And I think this is, to be fair, kind of from an implementation perspective, exactly what the Department of Commerce is trying to think about is the goal of this is not to just give a company cash that'll fully finance a project, right? The goal is to make sure that when somebody is applying for this funding, you're able to document in pretty serious detail how are you going to take kind of leverage private dollars, leverage state, local incentives like those you could get from cities and states and organizations like GPEC in Arizona, right? To really take advantage of this one-time opportunity to make some serious investments in the United States.
Just an open trough of money. There's a need. There's a need element there, which is, I think, very responsible for that. Last question, Joe, and you've kind of hit on these a little bit, but obviously we are the Greater Phoenix A to Z podcast, so we'd like to hear, how do you see this CHIPS money impacting the region and the state? Again, you've already kind of hit on some of that, but maybe expand just a bit on how we, as your boss's constituents and Greater Phoenix residents, how is that going to impact our network?
Yeah, I mean, it has the potential to be transformative. It's going to help to support the existing investments, like you mentioned, that we're already seeing from big leading edge manufacturers like TSMC and Intel. It's going to help those projects grow faster and help those companies go further in terms of their investments in Arizona. And it also can help us build a kind of more robust production ecosystem in Arizona. It'll help suppliers and materials manufacturers expand their presence in Arizona, which from a long-term perspective just further cements Arizona as one of the few hubs of semiconductor manufacturing, in the country, honestly, in the world. And it supports our long-term power, right? Like the supporting cast of characters that help to make Arizona such a manufacturing hub, NXP and Microchip and onsemi and VLSI and Honeywell and kind of all of these other manufacturers that are based in Arizona and really provide critical chip supplies for a whole range of consumer products that we've come to rely on. And I mean, I mentioned this before, right? But it also just comes down to these are thousands, potentially tens of thousands of good paying jobs in Arizona that don't require a 4-year degree that can help to attract, related industries that we're already seeing in Arizona. I mean, if you're an aerospace and defense company, if you're a renewable energy company, if you're looking to do, advanced manufacturing or build, electric vehicles, being able to be co-located in a region that has an expertise in microelectronics, which, we talked about the demand over the past 30 years is exponentially grown. The demand, 30 years from now is going to it's going to be astronomical. And so having Arizona be able to be one of those hubs is really exciting. And I mean, right, like as somebody who grew up in Arizona, who's from there, I mean, my family's lived in Arizona for like since the 1940s or something, like to be able to see kind of this community grow in such an exponential way because of these investments is really exciting to see. And I think if we take advantage of this funding in an effective way, we're going to see the dividends are going to be paid out for the state for decades to come, which is super exciting.
Joe, thank you so much for being a guest today. Really great information and insight into the CHIPS Act, how it's going to benefit Arizona. And on behalf of GPEC and Chris Camacho, I just want to thank you personally, as well as your other staff members. And of course, Senator Kelly, for getting this done. Getting a win in today's political world is very difficult. And this has such a big impact, not only here in the state and the region, but nationally. And so again, we just really appreciate all of your hard work. And I would love to have you on down the line, especially after the CHIPS process begins, so we could talk about all the great updates for the region and the state. So again, please tell the Senator thank you, and we look forward to having you on in the near future.
No, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Tim.
Okay, closing the show for us today is Sam Pinkal, VP of Business Development here at GPEC. Sam has 13 years in the industry, both the public and private sector. She's currently serving as the 2023 president of AZ Crew, the local chapter of Crew Network, the global organization dedicated to advancing women in commercial real estate. Casey, my co-host, told me that she is also a badass volleyball player, verbatim. And she is a recovering YouTube star with a single season of hashtag Snacks with Surprise still out there floating around on the internet. So maybe Google that. Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tim. It's glad to be here.
And thank you for finishing up. Earlier in the episode, we had just heard from Joe Russell in Senator Kelly's office talking about all things chips. And before that, Sean teed us up with just kind of everything semiconductors. So now we want to get into the meat and potatoes, your backyard, your business, locates, projects, capital expenditures, all the fun things. Mm-hmm. So let's jump right into this. TSMC announced its expansion to the market in 2020 and doubled up on that investment this past fall. What does that mean for the Phoenix region?
Really, it means a couple things. And I'll start with, it proves the market. Their FDI, their foreign direct investment, is safe and it's secure and it can be successful here. So Greater Phoenix hasn't historically been a primary destination for foreign investment. So kind of like in retail, when a major brand, like for example, a Costco, if a Costco moves to a town and is successful, other retailers take notice and they will be following. So similar to Costco, a global brand like TSMC plants its flag here, a sizable flag at that, other employers take notice, not just semiconductor employers, but other industries as well. The other thing it does is it helps Greater Phoenix continue to mature and evolve in its diversity and its identity. We're a young city. We often talk about this with people coming from out of town, is we were really grew in the 1950s when air conditioning was invented. So we're so young, especially compared to our other peer markets like a Chicago or a LA or New York especially. So it really helps us settle into ourselves and who we are. The state's history is in the 5 C's. Tim, good Arizona boy, do you know what they are?
Climate.
Boom.
Citrus.
Yes.
Cattle.
Nailed it.
Cotton.
Uh-huh.
Coppa.
Okay, I'm going to petition that we add a 6th C, chips.
I like it.
By the way, I was told there would be chips here. I don't know if you knew this, but I was on Snacks with Surprise. I know you knew that. Where are my snacks?
We will have that for the next round.
So second petition that's going to follow that is that we have a state snack of chips.
I like it. Also, you mentioned the youth of our city, and I think it's funny because I purchased a home 2 years ago, and it is a historic home, and it was built in 1941. So when I tell my friends from the East Coast, they're like, "Dog, I got shoes older than that." So just as a point of reference.
Yes, thank you. So then the third thing, how it's changing our city and what it does for us, it's going to change the demographics of our region. So historically, we've been primarily a white and Hispanic makeup. Like 85% of our population is one of those two categories. Current projections are like maybe 10%. That might be high in the past to be Asian and Pacific Islander, but I think because of what's happened with TSMC and the companies and suppliers that have followed them from that region, that projection is low. That's my personal opinion. We've been working with over 40 companies to expand into the market, and they're bringing with them hundreds of Taiwanese employees. And in some cases, they're families. There's thousands of people coming here to support this industry, to set up operations and to train Americans to then become future employees. So while many of them are here on temporary assignment, and the plan is for them to return to Taiwan or Korea or wherever they're coming from, I don't think any of us would be surprised if some of them stay. So I love the future of improving our diversity and increasing that here regionally.
Absolutely. Good stuff there. Now, I think the big question is, why is this development taking place in Greater Phoenix? Obviously, TSMC and others, they could go anywhere, but they came to our great state. So in your business development background, why do you think they landed here in the region?
Yep, that's always the first question. Why the heck would they pick Arizona and Phoenix? And it's a good question, and it's happening for a lot of reasons. So let's go back to our 5 C's. One of them is climate. Very stable, natural disaster-free climate. What that does is keep business operations continuous. If you remember, was it last winter where Dallas experienced that big freeze? What that did was stopped business operations for Samsung's a good example. It cost billions of dollars to be down for a couple weeks, I think. What they're going to experience here is not that. We don't have that risk of, in that same vein, we have very reliable power providers. So that was the breakdown in Texas, is that their power system wasn't set up to survive a disaster like that. We have 2 of the most reliable power providers here in our region, APS and SRP, with some of the lowest costs as well in the country. A couple other things that drove this decision is we have the space. We have hundreds of thousands of developable acres across our region, many of them protected by the Arizona State Land Department and reserving them for developments like this. We have the people. We're the fastest growing county a couple years running with the most people moving here. And we have the largest engineering school in the country. And also, while it's a hot topic, we also have a lot of water resources to support a company like TSMC. And while they use a lot, they're also going to reuse a lot. And when they are at full capacity, they're going to be one of the most efficient users of water in their industry at full ramp up. And at the subjective side, I think maybe even more importantly than all of that is we had the political will. At all levels of government, we had federal, we had state, we had county, we had local governments all playing together coordinatedly to bring TSMC to here.
Yeah, I know when folks outside of our network have asked me about TSMC, I've said that this is, because I just said it earlier this morning in an investor pitch meeting, that this was really like a 5-year plan from everything that I remember. Mayor Kay Gallego, City of Phoenix, Governor Ducey, Sandra Watson, Chris Camacho, all these folks, as you had just stated, from local all the way up to state, they played a huge role. And as Joe Russell just mentioned, on the federal side, Senator Kelly, Senator Sinema, their work with CHIPS, it's really been an all hands on deck mentality. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you were talking about, we fit the history, why they landed here. Why are large, we'll call them pillar investments like TSMC important to the region?
I like that term. So they're important in a lot of ways. And a couple of those we've already touched on, but maybe most immediately what they've done is catalyze the region and the growth of this market vertical. I mentioned we've worked with 40 companies. We're tracking over 70 related projects in our system at various levels of development, whether they are just kicking tires, as we would say. They're just checking it out. Does this really work? Does this make sense? To those who have located here, are under construction, and or are actually operating already. So many of them are suppliers to TSMC. Some are service providers. Others are hopeful to become a supplier or service provider to Intel. They've been here for 40 years, by the way, and they announced this last year that they're making a $30 billion expansion to their facility here in Chandler. So really what it's done is help us bring even more chip production to the U.S. through our ecosystem. So it's pretty remarkable, the renewal of commitment to the market that Intel's making by way of both themselves, their suppliers, and then attracting peer peer organizations like a TSMC.
Yeah, and our two other guests, again, both Joe and Sean really hit on Intel being that foundational movement 40 years ago, along with our current ecosystem from NXP and Semi and all these others that have really stepped up. So that's good. I think we're gonna have a great future here. Okay, now kind of, again, going into your specialty, how does advanced manufacturing like TSMC affect technology, entrepreneurs, and innovation here in Greater Phoenix?
Yeah, great question. When you have a huge industry shaping employer moving here and those who are already here expanding in our region, it really creates like a tidal wave. It's like throwing a boulder in a lake. It's creating this tidal wave and ripple effects into the community, into the education system. So ASU's creating specialty programs and curriculum, as are the community colleges, as are the tech schools, as are K-12 and the specialty after school education. In the startup ecosystems, there are companies that they have ideas and technology. Now they actually have people in market that are interested in expanding their technologies to optimize their operations, to make them more efficient, to make them more effective. So really, it permeates every part of our regional economy. And the intense focus on supporting that industry creates clusters of innovation in that way.
Okay, Sam, I'm going to ask you, pull out your little crystal ball here. Let's get our futurist glasses on.
Okay.
What does the future look like for the semiconductor industry, and where do we go from here?
I think it looks bright. I don't have glasses dark enough to shade my eyes. What's already happening here is this industry cluster is becoming more complete. And what I mean by that is there are many, many steps in the semiconductor process to manufacture them, package them, sell them. There's lots of steps in there. And so we've had a few of those here. And what's happening is that we're getting more and more of that complete ecosystem locating locally.
And I believe one step, because you were instrumental in this, we may have something coming down to Phoenix, which encompasses the entire semiconductor ecosystem.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. It was very exciting to promote publicly earlier in January that Semicon West, which is the largest semiconductor industry conference in the country, the third largest in the world, is moving from its home of 20 years in San Francisco to Phoenix. So Semi is making a couple changes to their conference. One, they're moving it from July to October, and in October 25, it'll come to Phoenix. And in October 27 and 29, they'll be trading years with San Francisco to Phoenix. And so after 2029, we have an opportunity to capture that full-time in Phoenix, which we're hopeful to do. So really that's a piece. It's economic development adjacent. It's not really a core part of our mission, but it does matter to this industry and supporting the health of that ecosystem.
How many of these folks will be here for that conference?
10,000.
That's a lot of people.
10,000 people from all over the world. This is not just a domestic conference. This is an international conference. It just happens to be hosted in the U.S. There's, I think, 5 others around the world that Semi hosts, and this is the domestic one for us.
And I'd be willing to bet Phoenix October conference weather, pretty hard to beat.
Not bad. Not bad at all.
Okay, so, we've been going into, again, we've looked in the past, we've looked to the future. So does Phoenix have the space and the infrastructure to keep expanding in that way that it has over the last 10 years?
So I don't think I can say it will keep growing the same way that it has for the past 10 years because we're not the same, but it can continue to grow. We definitely have the space. Don't forget that we can grow in 3 dimensions, out 2 ways, but we can go up. And so up is the way we haven't explored much yet in our city's history. Vertical dense growth in Greater Phoenix is like the final frontier, if you want to talk about space. Infrastructure-wise, the transportation corridors have really been set up well in anticipation of our growth. So I think in that regard, we're really well set up, but we certainly need to keep up that strategic investment. And finally, water, wastewater, and power infrastructure, those are really the things that are going to constrain us first. But I know that there's been a lot of thought and a lot of work on maintaining and expanding and optimizing those systems. Talking about the entrepreneurship and the innovation, there's lots of companies focused on how can we help produce more power. more efficiently and use less water. So I'm confident that we'll be able to support the next 10 years of growth.
That's great. Okay, Sam, final question. I believe you have a very big day coming up. Is it 2 months?
It is April 15th.
April
so
15th.
10 weeks.
You are getting married.
Yeah, I am.
Any last minute jitters? Anything? Y'all set? Ready to go?
Tim, I have never been so sure of anything in my entire life. Let me tell you, this boy, our first date was to get breakfast burritos, which are the best in the world.
Smart man.
I went on other dates with other guys, like first dates to get these burritos. They didn't say a single word about this burrito. So when Josh exclaimed about how good it was, I knew he was the one.
I mean, I'm a big fan of your fiance. I know he's probably listening.
He's pretty great.
I think it's a outstanding joint venture.
Ooh.
Cannot wait to see your marriage expand.
Ooh.
I don't know. Well, actually, maybe not expand, but you know what I mean. Succeed. How about that?
Thank you.
Want to see your marriage succeed. Well, Sam, thank you for your insight. You are a complete rock star in our beauty world here, and really providing just a nice analysis there, especially with our other two guests. So really appreciate your time. And again, thank you for gracing us with your presence.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you for joining us on the third episode of the Greater Phoenix A to Z podcast. The next episode is going to be a good one. Casey, my co-host here, she has arranged for several guests to join her for celebrating Black History Month. You won't want to miss it, so please be sure to tune in for that. Do me and our guests a favor and be sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast listening app. And if you're so inclined, please rate us 5 stars and leave us a fun comment. To keep up with what's happening in Greater Phoenix, please follow GPEC at Greater Phoenix and that's Phoenix PHX, on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. Till next time, be safe and well. Cheers.